The forest was endless, a cathedral of towering pines that whispered with secrets only the wind understood. The air carried a crisp bite of early autumn, scented with resin and the faint trace of smoke, long faded. Clint moved silently through the underbrush, hunger gnawing at him like a restless wolf inside his chest. Days without food had hollowed his strength, and the trail of deer he had followed since morning had vanished into the shadows, leaving only fragments of tracks, faint scrapes on bark, and the echo of hope dissolving into silence. Each step was heavy with fatigue, yet his spirit, stubborn and scarred by years of wandering, refused to yield. He was a man without a roof, without a place to return to, a wanderer drifting between towns, never staying long enough for names or memories. His only plan was survival, one day at a time, one breath against the weight of the wilderness. The golden light of the sinking sun filtered through the branches, painting the forest in hues of amber and fire. He pressed onward, heart quickening as though something unseen was watching him. The world was too still, too careful, as though holding its breath. Then, in one cruel instant, the silence shattered. A rope snapped tight around his leg, and his body was flung backward with a violent force that slammed the breath out of him. His hat tumbled away, his revolver slid across the dirt, and his lungs burned for air. Pain seared his ankle, and before he could gather himself, he saw movement in the trees. A shadow, quiet and deliberate, stepping into the last glow of daylight. She emerged like a vision from another world, an Apache woman, her bow drawn, the arrow trained steadily on his chest. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on him with a gaze sharp enough to pierce more than flesh. Her hair tumbled in loose black waves, her dress worn and frayed, patched by seasons of struggle. She stood with the raw grace of survival, a spirit both weary and unbroken. Clint froze, the snare biting deep, heart pounding harder than any battle he had ever faced. She had him. He knew it. And yet she did not fire. Instead, she circled him in silence, steady and unshaken, her every motion precise. With a flick of her arrow's tip, she slid his revolver farther away, claiming it as her own, before binding his wrists with coarse rope. He could have fought. He was stronger. But something in her presence stopped him, something quiet and commanding that told him resistance would be meaningless. She was not acting in anger. She was acting in necessity. Her silence was more powerful than any threat. Bound, helpless, yet strangely captivated, Clint followed when she gestured for him to rise. Each step was painful, his leg throbbing, his hands tingling from the ropes, but his gaze kept returning to her. There was mystery in her stillness, in the way she watched him without speaking, as though measuring his soul. They reached a clearing where her camp stood, humble and lonely, a fragile shelter stitched together with hide and canvas. Smoke rose faintly from a fire pit, carrying the scent of roots and meat simmering in a pot. Inside the tent, shadows flickered against worn furs and clay pots, everything shaped by necessity, not comfort. She motioned him to sit, and though his wrists were tied, she handed him a cup of warm water and later a bowl of thin stew. The gesture bewildered him more than her snare had. Why feed him? Why spare him? She had disarmed him, yet she offered kindness in silence, an act as healing as it was unsettling. As the night grew colder, Clint studied her from across the fire. Her name came in a single word, spoken soft as the rustle of leaves. Ayoka. In that moment, a thread, invisible yet unbreakable, was tied between them. Not of romance yet, not of trust, but of something older, something that began where survival met longing. For the first time in weeks, Clint felt the weight of his loneliness ease, if only by a fraction. She sat close to the flames, her profile etched by the firelight, and he wondered not how he would escape, but why she had chosen not to destroy him. And so their story began, born not of choice, but of accident, of hunger and traps, of silence heavier than words. A man without a home, a woman without a tribe, two souls cast adrift who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. The ropes around his wrists no longer felt like chains, but like the start of something he could not yet name. Somewhere beyond the fire, coyotes howled into the night, but inside that small shelter, the world had changed. If this story awakens something gentle in your heart, if it stirs the healing warmth of connection, I invite you to breathe with it, to let it rest in your soul. And if you find light in these words, a reminder that even in the loneliest forests love can be found, let your voice be part of this journey. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe, so this story may continue to reach those who need its warmth. Your presence here is more than support. It is part of the fire that keeps these tales alive, reminding us all that love, even in the harshest wilderness, has the power to heal. The night deepened, shadows stretching long, but neither Clint nor Ioka slept easily. They had not yet spoken of what tomorrow might bring, nor of the dangers that lingered in the woods. Yet in the quiet, in the shared breath of strangers who no longer felt entirely alone, something sacred was born. And as the embers glowed low, the story prepared to turn toward a dawn neither of them expected. The morning came with a hush, the kind of silence that made even the trees seem to hold their breath. Clint stirred, aching from the rough ground, the rope still pressing into his wrists, though looser now, almost as if she had chosen to test his will rather than restrain him completely. The fire had burned low, embers glowing like fragile stars, their warmth barely holding back the chill that crept in through the tent seams. His eyes found her before anything else. Ioka sat near the coals, her dark braid falling loose against her shoulder, her movements steady as she stirred a pot. The scent of herbs and broth filled the air, fragile but comforting, as though survival had been softened into something tender. She glanced at him once. No words, just a brief acknowledgement that he was awake, then poured the broth into a wooden bowl and set it near his hands. She didn't untie him fully, only loosened the knot enough that he could lift the bowl. It was a simple act, yet it felt heavy with meaning. She trusted him just enough to eat, just enough to choose whether he would honor the fragile peace between them. He took the bowl carefully, the steam curling upward, the taste richer than the thin stew of the night before. It warmed his chest, chasing away the edge of hunger that had haunted him for days. As he ate, he studied her, the small scars on her hands, the way she held herself with quiet caution, the way her eyes sometimes flickered toward him and then away, like she was searching for something but unwilling to show it. She had been alone too long. He could see it in the way she rationed her movements, saving energy, saving breath. Every part of her spoke of survival, yet there was a softness under it, a gentleness she kept hidden, revealed only in fleeting moments, like giving him food or water. Clint felt a shift inside himself, something small and healing, as if the emptiness he carried was filling with something unspoken. When he finished, she reached forward and collected the bowl, her fingers brushing against his as she pulled it back. The touch was brief, accidental perhaps, but it left a warmth that lingered longer than the stew. She set the bowl aside, her eyes finally meeting his. For a long breath, neither moved. Then she spoke softly, her voice halting but clear enough. "Ayoka." She touched her chest lightly. He nodded, answering with his own name. Clint. A fragile bridge had been built, one word at a time, spanning the silence between them. Later, when the sun climbed higher, she pulled back the hide flap and stepped into the clearing, the light falling across her face. Clint followed, still bound but moving slower, his leg throbbing from the snare. The world outside her tent was raw and vast, pine trees stretching endless, a creek winding silver at the edge of the rocks, the air crisp with the bite of the season turning colder. She moved through it with quiet certainty, checking a snare, adjusting it with skilled fingers, her presence blending with the forest as if she were part of it. Clint watched her, realizing she was not simply surviving. She was rooted, enduring like the earth itself. He asked her a question then, not with sharpness, but with gentleness. "You live here alone?" Her eyes lifted toward him, then down again. After a pause, she nodded once. The answer was plain, but her silence afterward was heavier than words. He didn't press, though curiosity stirred. In her solitude, he saw a reflection of his own wandering, two lives shaped by absence, two souls carved by loss. Yet standing near her now, he felt the wilderness less empty than it had been the day before. By midday, she untied his wrists fully, though her bow and knife were never far from reach. She was cautious, but she was also offering him a choice, freedom without dismissal, trust without demand. Clint flexed his hands, feeling the ache of blood returning, and made no move to run. He simply stood beside her as she gathered herbs, as she moved along the creek, as she returned to her camp. He was no longer just her captive, he was something else, though neither of them named it yet. That evening, when the light faded and shadows stretched long, they shared another meal by the fire. She handed him a stronger portion this time, her hands steady as she passed it across the small distance between them. The flames cast gold across her features, softening the sharpness of her gaze. Clint found himself studying the way the firelight caught in her eyes, the way her hair framed her face, the way she leaned closer to the warmth, as if it were her only shield against the vast loneliness around them. He realized then that he did not want to leave, not yet. Something about her silence was more healing than any words could have been. Something about her presence eased the restless ache in his chest, the part of him that had wandered from place to place, searching for a roof, a name, a reason. Ayoka did not offer promises, nor did she ask for them, but she gave him food, water, shelter, and the unspoken choice to stay. And in the quiet of the fire, as coyotes called far in the distance, Clint chose not to think of leaving at all. The forest outside remained wild, carrying the echoes of threats yet unseen, but inside the circle of light they shared, there was a fragile peace. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something that glowed softly like embers, something that promised warmth if they were willing to nurture it. The night pressed close, the cold wind rattling against the hide walls, but together, sitting across from one another, they carried a spark that might outlast even the darkest storms. And as Clint lay down near the fire once more, he did not feel like a prisoner bound by rope. He felt tethered by something gentler, something invisible, a bond that pulled him closer to the woman who had spared his life and, without meaning to, had begun to heal his heart. The fire crackled. Ioka's shadow swayed softly across the tent walls, and Clint closed his eyes, knowing the story between them was only just beginning. The night gave way to a softer grey dawn, the air sharp with frost, and the faint perfume of pine resin drifting from the coals. Clint awoke to the sound of quiet movement, her footsteps light, deliberate, almost like part of the forest itself. His wrists, once bound, now lay free at his sides, the rope loosened sometime in the hours of sleep, as though Ioka had chosen to test the measure of his trust. He stretched slowly, joints stiff, breath clouding in the cool air. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the crushing weight of being utterly alone. The fire was still alive, its glow weaving warmth into the thin fabric of morning, and across from him she knelt, stirring a pot with graceful patience. Her dark hair had been gathered into a loose braid, but strands escaped, catching the light like threads of midnight silk. He watched her quietly, as though afraid the moment would break if he spoke. She had built her world from fragments, a tent stitched from hide, a fire made from patient gathering, a pot that held enough to soften hunger's edge. It was little, but it was survival, and within its fragile simplicity lay a healing warmth he hadn't felt in years. His stomach growled before he could stop it, the sound pulling her eyes toward him. She didn't smile, but she poured broth into a bowl and set it gently before him. The gesture was wordless kindness, an offering not just of food, but of recognition. He drank slowly, savoring each mouthful, and as he ate, he studied her with the curiosity of a man who had forgotten how to wonder. Her face was young, yet worn by seasons of hardship. Her hands bore scars, her dress carried patches, but her movements were steady, resilient, untouched by despair. Every part of her spoke of a spirit that endured, unbroken by exile or solitude. Something within him softened. He had thought survival meant steel, meant keeping others out. Yet here she was, showing him that survival could also mean sharing, water, food, silence, even the faint warmth of trust. When the bowl was empty, he set it down carefully, the weight of gratitude heavier than the food itself. She sat across from him, her gaze steady, waiting. At last, she lifted her hand, tapped her chest, and repeated softly, "Ioka." The name lingered in the air like a prayer. Clint nodded, his own voice rough but sure. Clint. The exchange was simple, almost fragile, yet it carried the power of a vow. Two names, two stories, no longer lost entirely to silence. Later, when the sun climbed higher and melted the rim of frost, Ioka moved outside. Clint followed at a distance, his legs still aching from the snare. The clearing unfolded like a secret place, untouched by the world beyond. Trees standing as guardians, the creek glimmering like silver thread, rocks sheltering the little camp she had claimed. She moved through it as if she belonged to every stone, every tree, every breath of wind. He found himself watching not just her strength, but the loneliness beneath it. She was part of the forest, but also apart from it, like a bird that had built a nest too far from its flock. She knelt at a snare, fingers deft as she reset it, and for the first time her voice came low, halting but clear enough for him to understand. "No, tribe." Her hand swept outward toward the horizon. Clint's chest tightened at the confession. She had not chosen this solitude. It had been carved into her life. Exiled, cast aside, forced into the wilderness with nothing but her own hands to keep her alive. He said nothing at first, for he knew what it meant to be unwanted. He had drifted through towns like a shadow, nameless, rootless. Their losses were different, but the emptiness was the same. Back at the tent, she cut the rope from his wrists fully. He did not run. He did not even think of it. Instead, he sat by the fire, flexing his fingers, while she worked beside him, cleaning a rabbit she had trapped earlier. Her hands were steady, her motions economical, but when she placed a strip of dried sinew beside him with the simple instruction, "stronger," it was not just a gift of material, it was a gift of trust. He mended his torn coat with it, each stitch pulling him deeper into the unspoken bond forming between them. As the day waned, their gestures grew into conversation beyond words. He offered her a strip of meat from the rabbit. She nodded, accepting without suspicion. She pointed to the trees, showing him where danger sometimes lingered, her voice soft but her meaning clear. He listened, not just with his ears, but with the quiet part of himself that had gone numb long ago. With every glance, every shared moment by the fire, the silence between them turned less into distance and more into connection. That evening, the forest darkened with the promise of night, coyotes crying far away. They sat together closer than before, the firelight flickering across their faces. Clint felt the change within him, the hard edges of loneliness softening, replaced by something tender and alive. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and though she did not ask, he laid down nearer to her side of the fire. Her eyes flicked toward him, wary for only a heartbeat, then settled again into quiet acceptance. In that silence, Clint realized something he had not dared to hope for. He was not her prisoner anymore. He was not merely a wanderer lost in the woods. He was becoming part of her fragile world, and she of his. The night grew colder, but the warmth between them lingered, a healing flame neither of them had expected. And as the stars turned overhead, he closed his eyes, knowing that whatever bound them now was stronger than rope, something that could carry them beyond survival into the beginnings of something far greater. The days blended into one another, stitched together by the rhythm of fire and silence, by the unspoken understanding that grew each time their eyes met across the glow of embers. Clint no longer counted hours as he once had when drifting from town to town. Time here was measured differently, by the sound of Ioka's footsteps in the clearing, by the steam rising from a pot at dawn, by the steady cadence of her breath when night wrapped itself around the little shelter. Each morning she moved with the quiet grace of someone who had long carried the weight of solitude. Yet when she set food or water in front of him, something inside her eyes softened, if only for a heartbeat. That small change, invisible to anyone else, became everything to Clint. He learned her silences first. She did not waste words, and when she chose to speak, her voice came low and careful, as though language itself was a fragile bridge. She had told him she had no tribe, and though her English was broken, he understood enough. Exile had carved her life into a hollow space where trust rarely survived. Yet here she was, sharing fire and food with him, giving him more freedom each day. Her wounds were not on her skin alone. They were buried deep, carved by the cruel judgment of others. Clint carried his own scars, different yet parallel. He knew the loneliness of being unwanted, the bitterness of drifting, the ache of searching for belonging in places that offered none. And so, when he looked at her, he saw not a stranger, but a mirror. By the creek one afternoon, he caught her watching him while he washed his hands in the cold current. She did not look away when their eyes met. Instead, she said a word slowly. "Stay." It was not a demand, not a plea, but a statement. A quiet acknowledgement that she wanted him near. He nodded once, without hesitation. "I stay." The simplicity of that exchange settled over them like a vow, unspoken yet binding. For a woman who had been cast away, and for a man who had wandered too long, those words carried the weight of sanctuary. Danger reminded them of their fragility. The sound of hoofbeats came one evening, faint but deliberate, and Ioka stiffened like a deer, sensing the arrow before it flew. Clint felt the tension too, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver she had returned to him without bullets. Her bow was already in her grip, her body a line of focus and stillness. When strangers passed near the clearing, two men with sharp eyes and restless hands, Clint understood fully why she had first set snares not only for animals, but for intruders. She had been hunted before, and survival had demanded caution sharper than steel. That night, after the men were gone and silence returned, she placed the bullets in his palm, one by one, her gaze unflinching. "Trust," she whispered. He closed his hand over them, heart heavy with the knowledge that she had offered him the one thing she had guarded most. Their bond grew in the spaces between fear and tenderness. Working side by side, they built small fortifications, gathered wood, mended what little they had. Ioka showed him where she hid her belongings, her secret cache tucked behind stones, as if to tell him he was no longer an outsider. In return, Clint taught her how to grip the revolver steady, how to brace against the recoil. She learned quickly, her focus unshaken, her hands strong. It was not just skill he gave her, it was a piece of himself, a fragment of trust returned. Nights became gentler. At first, they lay on opposite sides of the fire, each keeping to their own silence. But gradually, the distance shrank. A shared blanket folded closer, her hand brushing his sleeve as she reached for wood, his shoulder near enough to feel the warmth of her breath when she leaned forward. One evening, when the wind cut colder than before, she placed a second blanket near his, not apart, but touching. He did not move away. Neither spoke of it, but when their hands brushed in the dark, neither pulled back. Healing came quietly, not with declarations, but with the simple miracle of presence. Clint began to see the woman beyond survival. Ioka carved small figures from bone when the chores were done, shapes of birds and animals, her hands moving with care he hadn't expected. One night, she handed him a carving, a small bird tied with a strip of leather. "For protection," she said. He tied it to his holster, touched by the gesture more deeply than he could voice. In return, he shared his name in full, unfolding a scrap of parchment from his coat that carried the letters of a life he had almost forgotten. "Clint Rowe," he told her. She repeated it slowly, her voice tender, shaping his name like a promise. For the first time in years, he felt as though his name meant something again. The wilderness, once only hunger and danger, began to shift into something else. Home. They gathered stones to raise a sturdier shelter, their hands working in rhythm, their silences turning companionable. He carried wood while she wove reeds, and in the quiet intervals they exchanged glances that spoke more than words could. Each day was marked by survival, yet beneath it grew the steady pulse of belonging. When Ayoka brought out a dress she had once made for a wedding that never came to be, Clint understood without needing explanation. She had been promised to another long ago, before death and exile. Now she stood before him with the dress in her hands, uncertain, fragile. "Maybe again," she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You belong now. You always did." That night she wore the dress. Its beads were faded, its stitches imperfect, but on her it became a living flame. She stood in the firelight, eyes searching his face, waiting not for judgment, but for recognition. Clint rose slowly, the weight of everything they had endured between them, and spoke with a raw honesty that trembled in his chest. "You're beautiful." Her answer was only a whisper. "Stay." He did not need to think. "I choose you," he said, and when her hand pressed against his heart, the healing that had begun in silence bloomed into certainty. They were no longer two lost souls bound by necessity. They had crossed into something deeper, two exiles who had chosen each other, two wanderers who had found a place not marked on any map. In the glow of the fire, with the forest singing softly beyond the tent, Clint and Ayoka stood at the threshold of love, fragile yet unshakable. And as the night closed around them, their story carried forward, no longer built only on survival, but on the tender, steady promise of a life they would create together. The first snow came quietly, a thin veil drifting through the trees, settling across pine needles and stones, turning the harshness of the wilderness into something softer, almost forgiving. Clint woke to find Ayoka already outside, her figure wrapped in a hide, her braid touched by white flakes that melted as soon as they kissed her skin. She was standing near the ridge, watching the horizon as if the world might speak to her in the language of smoke and shadow. When he joined her, the cold biting his breath, she lifted her hand toward a distant line in the sky where faint smoke rose. Not from their fire, not from accident, men. The threat was far, but real. Clint said nothing at first, only stepped closer, shoulder brushing hers. They both knew what it meant. Danger would always circle back, no matter how deep in the forest they hid. Yet for the first time, he did not feel the urge to run. The thought of leaving her side was unbearable, heavier than any fear of what lay beyond the trees. "We'll be ready," he said softly, and she nodded, her gaze steady. There was no panic in her, only the calm strength of a woman who had weathered storms far crueler than this. That day they worked side by side with a new urgency. Clint cut and stacked stones for a stronger windbreak, while Ayoka sealed the seams of their shelter with pine resin, her hands quick and sure. She wove reeds into mats to keep the cold from creeping up through the ground, her movements rhythmic, healing in their quiet purpose. Every action was survival, yet it felt like something greater. Two lives weaving into one, every stone and stitch another vow unspoken. As dusk fell, they sat together by the fire, knees almost touching, the stew simmering low between them. Clint tore a piece of flatbread Ioka had baked, handing her the larger portion without thought. She took it with a glance, her fingers brushing his, a touch that lingered like a promise. After a silence filled only by the crackle of flames, she reached into a small pouch and pulled out a strip of leather. It was rough, stitched with uneven thread, yet across its surface one word had been sewn carefully. Row. She placed it in his lap. "You gave name," she whispered, her voice quiet as falling snow. "I keep it." Clint stared at the piece of leather, the letters of his name stitched into it by her hands, and something inside him shifted. He looked at her face, lit by firelight, her eyes unwavering. "You want me to wear this?" She shook her head gently. "I want us both." He felt the weight of her words, more binding than any oath spoken in church. He nodded slowly. "Then we start fresh, together." Her shoulders eased, the faintest glimmer of relief softening her face. That night she wore the beaded dress again, not because it was a ceremony, but because she chose to. She stood in the firelight, the beads catching the glow like stars caught in fabric. Clint rose to meet her, his heart heavy with gratitude and awe. She stepped closer, her whisper brushing against him. "Stay, not for danger, not for hunger. Stay, because you choose me." He held her gaze, voice steady. "I already did. I choose you." She placed his hand over her heart, her other hand resting on his chest, and in that fragile, healing moment, the wilderness seemed to fall away, leaving only them. Two souls, no longer wandering, no longer cast out, but belonging at last. When the snow thickened in the following days, they moved deeper into the ridge, building their shelter higher, walls braced with pine, a roof layered with bark and hide. Their hands worked together without hesitation, passing tools, steadying beams, each motion an act of trust. Ioka carved small figures again, this time shaping not a bird but a man, tall, one hand open as if offering. When she showed it to Clint, her voice was soft. "You stay. You protect." He held the carving longer than he meant to, the weight of being seen for who he was, not just what he had lost, sinking deep into his chest. "I haven't had a home in years," he confessed quietly. She looked at him with that steady patience of hers and said, "You stop now." He nodded, and for the first time he believed it. Evenings became a sanctuary. They sat beneath the rough roof, the fire crackling between them, Ioka mending clothes while Clint sharpened his blade. Sometimes she leaned against his shoulder, silent, steady, her presence more healing than words. Sometimes they shared laughter, small, fragile moments that surprised them both, blooming like wildflowers through the cracks of their sorrow. And sometimes there was only silence, but it was no longer empty. It was full, layered with the comfort of knowing neither of them was alone. One night, after hours of quiet work, Clint pulled from his coat a folded parchment, worn from years of travel. He handed it to her, the old army pass with his name written clear. She traced the letters slowly with her finger, sounding them out with care. "Clint Rowe." She touched her chest, voice low. "Ioka. No family name." He looked at her, the firelight painting the sorrow in her eyes, and said gently, "Then take mine if you ever want." She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice trembled with certainty. "I think I want." Later, when the cold pressed against their shelter, they wrapped themselves in one blanket, no barriers between them, no ropes, no weapons. Her hand found his in the dark, and he did not pull away. She whispered, "You're not prisoner anymore." He smiled faintly, pressing his forehead against hers. "You never were." The kiss that followed was quiet, tender, carrying not just desire but healing, the mending of two broken lives into one. The snow outside thickened, the forest slept beneath white silence, but within the shelter warmth grew. They were no longer strangers, no longer exiles. They were two souls who had chosen each other freely, and that choice burned brighter than any fire. And as the winter deepened, Clint and Ayoka began to shape not just a shelter, but a home, their hearts bound by something unshakable, carrying them forward into the life they were building, together. The days on the ridge began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost like life had always meant to be this way. Morning light spilled through the gaps of their shelter, catching on Ayoka's dark hair as she rose before him, her movements quiet and certain, tending to the fire before the frost could bite too deep. Clint would stir not long after, the scent of pine smoke and the faint bitterness of tea pulling him from dreams that no longer left him hollow. They ate together in silence sometimes, other times with small exchanges, her pointing toward the traps, him answering with a nod, or his quiet words of gratitude when she passed him a bowl. Every gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of healing. In each act they stitched themselves closer, the distance between them shrinking until it was no longer there. Clint found himself building more than walls and fire pits. He began carving logs into shapes that could hold tools, flattening ground for storage, reinforcing stone foundations, all while Ayoka worked beside him, weaving reeds, patching hides, or gathering herbs. Their hands crossed often, tools passed seamlessly, movements flowing like two halves of one effort. It astonished him how natural it became, how her presence no longer felt like something to earn or defend, but like air, necessary, steady, constant. She didn't smile often, but when her eyes lingered on him while he worked, something in his chest loosened. A knot that had been tied for years unspooled in her quiet gaze. The evenings, wrapped in firelight, became the place where their bond deepened most. One night, Clint tried teaching her to aim with the revolver again. She stood firm, the weapon steady in her hand, her breath calm. When the shot rang out, the sound cracked the silence, and the bullet found its mark in the bark of a tree. She turned to him, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying a faint light, the smallest trace of pride. He stepped closer, adjusted her stance gently, his hands brushing over her shoulders. She did not flinch, and for the first time he felt the boundary between them not as a line to respect, but as a space she had begun to welcome him into. Later that same night, as the fire burned low, she pulled from her pouch a small carving of bone shaped into a bird, wings spread. She pressed it into his hand. "For you," she said. Her voice carried no embellishment, only sincerity. Clint held it carefully, his thumb tracing the delicate work, humbled by the gift. "You made this?" She nodded, and though she looked down, there was a softness in her face. He tied it to his holster, touched beyond words. In return, he pulled the parchment with his name again, showing her what little of his past he had left. "Clint Rowe," he repeated, and she spoke it after him with reverence, like a prayer she wanted to remember. He told her then, voice steady, "Maybe one day you could take it as your own." She didn't answer in words, but her eyes lingered on him, and he understood. Winter deepened. The forest grew quieter, snow falling heavier, muffling the world into silence. But inside their shelter, warmth blossomed. They began to share not just work, but closeness. Blankets pulled tighter, shoulders brushing as they ate, her head resting briefly on his shoulder when the fire crackled low. One night, when the wind howled fiercest, Ayoka placed her blanket beside his without hesitation. He turned toward her in the dim glow, and for the first time their lips touched, not desperate, not rushed, but tender. A healing kiss that seemed to seal every fracture life had left in them. His hand cupped her back, steady, gentle, and she leaned into him with trust so complete it left him breathless. From then on, there was no more space between them when they slept. Their bodies shared warmth against the bitter cold, breaths mingling in the dark. She would sometimes whisper small fragments of her past in broken words, her family lost, her people casting her away, the cruel weight of being called cursed. Clint would answer not with questions, but with the steady beat of his hand over hers, a presence telling her she was no curse to him, that she was more than what exile had named her. In return, she listened when he spoke of wandering, of towns that never felt like home, of nights spent with nothing but whiskey for comfort. She touched his arm lightly when he confessed these things, a gesture that carried more healing than any reply. They began to mark the ridge as theirs. Clint carved a post into the earth and hung a scrap of cloth from it, letting the wind catch it. "Now they'll know," he said, and Ayoka looked at him with quiet certainty. "Know we live. Know we family." Together, they shaped not just survival, but belonging, their days filled with the rhythm of work, their nights with the rhythm of hearts beating close. As spring edged closer, the forest softened. Ice broke on the creek, buds formed on branches, and Ayoka's laughter came more easily, soft but real, like a secret she no longer needed to hide. Clint found himself smiling more often too, the weight he had carried for years lifting each time her hand found his. When she wore her beaded dress again, not for ritual, but simply because she wished to, he saw not just beauty, but the truth of who she was. A woman who had endured, who had chosen, and who now allowed herself to be chosen in return. He whispered into her hair that night, "I'm not leaving." And she answered against his chest, "I know." The bond they had built was no longer fragile. It was steady, strong, as enduring as the ridge itself. They had been strangers, then captor and captive, then partners bound by survival. Now they were something deeper, something rooted. The wilderness had given them no promises, but it had given them each other. And as they stood one morning on the overlook, the valley stretched wide beneath them, Clint's arm around her shoulders, Ayoka leaning into him with quiet certainty. They knew that whatever storms came, they would not face them alone. Their hearts had found their home, not in walls or towns, but in each other, in the healing truth of love that had chosen them both. The ridge had become their sanctuary, a place shaped not only by stone and hide, but by the rhythm of two hearts learning to move together. Spring unfolded gently, weaving warmth back into the land. The creek rushed stronger with melted snow. The trees unfurled green leaves like banners of renewal, and wildflowers bloomed shyly in patches of sun. For Clint, each dawn no longer brought the ache of wandering but the peace of waking with Ayoka beside him. Her breath against his chest, her hand curled lightly near his, was enough to remind him that this life was no dream. He had stopped running, and she had stopped being alone. They spent their mornings walking the forest trails together, Ayoka showing him the hidden places she once kept secret. She pointed to a hollow in the rocks where she had stashed dried herbs, to a tree scarred by lightning that she considered a guidepost, to the meadow where she gathered roots when food was scarce. She shared not just the land, but her history within it, allowing him to see how her solitude had been shaped and endured. Clint listened with patience, carrying each detail as though it were a gift. In return, he told her stories of drifting, of towns where faces blurred into smoke, and saloons where laughter was only a mask for sorrow. She listened quietly, her eyes steady, and when he faltered, she touched his hand, as if to say his road had ended here with her. Their bond deepened not only in words, but in the daily work of survival that now felt like ritual. They repaired the shelter with new bark, lined it with soft furs Ayoka had tanned, and built a second fire ring closer to the overlook. Together they raised a frame for drying meat, Clint lifting heavy beams while Ayoka lashed them with sinew. It was labor, but it was shared, and in that sharing bloomed a sweetness neither had ever known. When their hands brushed passing tools, neither pulled away. When their eyes met across the fire, neither looked down. What had once been silence filled with suspicion had become silence filled with trust, with a tenderness that healed more deeply than either expected. At night, the firelight seemed to draw them closer still. Sometimes Ayoka mended clothing while Clint carved small pieces of wood, his knife shaping figures with steady patience. One evening he carved a simple ring from bone, smooth and plain but strong. When he handed it to her, her eyes widened slightly. He said nothing. He didn't need to, but when she slid it onto a cord around her neck, she held it as though it was the most precious thing she had ever been given. Later, she brought out the beaded dress once more, wearing it not as a memory of what had been lost, but as a symbol of what she was choosing now. She stood before him in the fire's glow, her voice soft but unwavering. "I belong again." He rose to her, his chest aching with the weight of her courage, and answered simply, "With me." There were moments of laughter, too, small but bright. Clint discovered that Ayoka had a quiet humor, revealed in the way she raised her brow when he stumbled over her words in Apache, or how she let a rare, gentle smile slip when he burned the stew trying to cook without her. Each sound of her laughter was a balm, filling cracks in his spirit that had ached too long. For Ayoka, his presence was its own comfort, the way he reached for her hand without hesitation, the way he shielded her from the worst of the wind, the way he said her name like it was a prayer. In each gesture she felt the healing of a loneliness that had once seemed endless. One afternoon, as they stood by the stream, Clint splashed water over his face, laughing at the shock of its chill. Ayoka watched him, her expression unreadable at first. Then, quietly, she stepped closer, knelt by the edge, and cupped her hands to offer him water. It was such a small act, yet when their eyes met, it felt like a vow. He leaned forward, drinking from her palms, his lips brushing against her skin, and the look they shared afterward was enough to leave the air trembling with something more than survival, something sacred. As spring ripened into early summer, their love grew into something neither of them could hide. They no longer slept with distance between them. Their blankets had become one, their breaths mingling in the dark. Ayoka would rest her head against Clint's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and he would trace gentle circles along her back until her breathing slowed. It was not passion that consumed them, but warmth that restored them, healing in every quiet embrace, every touch that told them they were no longer lost. Clint sometimes thought of the years behind him, the wandering roads, the towns that had never cared for his name. He would glance at Ayoka, bent over her work by the firelight, her hands strong, her presence steady, and realize that all those empty years had been the path leading him here. And Ayoka, once cast out, once called cursed, now found herself chosen, not by accident, not by pity, but by love freely given. One evening, as the sun set behind the jagged hills, painting the sky with fire and gold, Clint took her hand and led her to the overlook. The valley stretched below, endless and wild, but for once the horizon did not feel like exile. He turned to her, his voice rough with emotion. "I wandered a long time, Ayoka, but I'm done wandering. I've found my home." She touched his chest gently, her eyes shimmering in the fading light. "Home is here," she whispered. "With us." They stood together, the wind brushing against them, the earth vast beneath their feet. For the first time in their lives, neither of them was running. Neither of them was alone. And as the stars began to rise, Clint wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, knowing that the healing they had found would not fade with the seasons. It was rooted deep, unshakable, a love that had been born in silence, tested by danger, and sealed in the quiet certainty of choice. The night descended, the fire called them back, and their steps together carried them toward a future that no longer felt uncertain. It was no longer about surviving the wilderness, but about building something within it, a life stitched from devotion, trust, and the tender truth that love, once found, was enough to heal everything. And in that truth, they prepared to walk into whatever awaited them, side by side, never to be parted again. The valley lay quiet, under a sky painted with the deep hues of twilight, the last embers of the sun dissolving into shades of violet and gold. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Clint and Ayoka sat shoulder to shoulder at the edge of their shelter, the fire crackling low between them. Smoke drifted upward like a prayer, soft and steady, as though the earth itself was breathing with them. They had built so much since those first uncertain days, stone walls braced against the wind, hides sewn into a roof that no longer leaked, racks filled with dried meat and herbs. Yet it wasn't the shelter, nor the fire, nor the food that made this place home. It was the way their hands found each other in the quiet, the way their hearts beat steady as one, even when no words were spoken. Ayoka leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and Clint drew the blanket tighter around them both. She had changed him in ways he had not known were possible. A man who once drifted nameless through towns now bore the weight of being chosen, of being loved, of being needed. And Ayoka, once cast out, once burdened with the cruel whispers of a curse, now found herself whole again. Her laughter, rare but true, had returned. Her eyes no longer carried only the hardness of survival, but also the warmth of trust, of healing, of hope. The firelight wrapped them in gold, flickering across Ayoka's face. She lifted her gaze to his, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, then simply placed her hand against his chest. The gesture said everything. She did not need to ask him to stay. He already had. He brushed a kiss across her temple, lingering there as though the world might break if he let go too soon. In that moment, the wilderness faded into silence. There were no bandits, no threats, no shadows from the past, only the two of them, alive and unbroken, carried by a love neither of them had dared to dream. Seasons shifted, but their bond only deepened. They learned to laugh together in the rain, to share quiet meals in the warmth of summer sun, to face the harsh bite of winter with hands clasped tight. Each trial, each storm, only carved them closer. The ridge was no longer just a place of survival, it became the canvas of their story. Here, where once there had been nothing but exile and wandering, now there was belonging. A man and a woman who had lost everything had found each other, and in that finding had discovered the most powerful truth. Love is the only fire that cannot be extinguished. Clint often thought of the day he first saw her. Bow drawn, arrow steady, her silence sharper than steel. She had every reason to end his life, yet instead she spared him, fed him, offered him water. What began as a snare in the forest became the very net that held his heart. And Ayoka, remembering the man bound before her fire, understood now why she had not turned him away. Somewhere deep in her spirit she had seen him, not just a stranger, but a soul as lost as hers. Their paths, carved by pain, had not crossed by accident. They had been led here, to this moment, where two outcasts had become each other's family. On a night when the stars blazed brighter than usual, Ayoka brought out the beaded dress again. She wore it not with hesitation, but with quiet pride. Clint stood and took her hands, their fingers intertwining. No priest, no witness, no grand ceremony. Just the forest, the fire, and their vows spoken in silence. She pressed her forehead against his, her breath trembling, and he whispered, "You are my home." She answered with only two words, soft but certain, "Always us." And in that instant the wilderness itself seemed to bless them, the wind carrying their promise into the endless night. From that night forward, their love was not only survival, but creation. They carved, they built, they planted, they dreamed. The ridge became more than shelter. It became legacy. Clint carved a second post, placing it firm in the ground beside the first, and from it they hung strips of cloth and beads Ayoka had stitched. The fluttering fabric told the world what words did not need to say. This was their land, their love, their family. And together they faced each dawn not as two broken souls, but as one whole life. Time would bring more storms, more strangers passing through, more seasons that tested their strength. Yet, no matter what came, they had already found the truth that mattered most. Love was not an escape from hardship, but the strength to endure it. Love was not chains, but freedom. Love was not fragile, but eternal. healing them both with every embrace, every whispered vow, every breath taken side by side. As the fire burned low, Clint and Ioka sat close, wrapped in one blanket, watching sparks drift upward into the dark. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The silence between them was no longer lonely. It was full, overflowing with everything they had become. A cowboy who had once wandered without a name, an Apache woman who had once been cast aside. Now, together, they were more than survivors. They were love, made flesh beneath the stars. And if this story has touched something inside you, if it has brought you warmth, or healed a quiet ache, or reminded you that love can bloom even in the loneliest places, I invite you to share your heart in return. Leave a comment, let your voice join ours, and if this tale has given you light, like it and subscribe so that others may also find the healing fire within these words. Your presence here is part of the story too, and together we keep the flame alive.